The Christmas season always brought a comforting hush over our small neighborhood, a serenity matched only by the quiet snowfall that blanketed our little home. It was meant to be a time of joy and togetherness, but as the holiday drew near this year, our home felt muted, as if the spirit of the season had chosen to bypass us entirely. My son, Caleb, had returned home a few days earlier, looking more like a shadow of himself than the vibrant, confident man I knew. His breakup with his longtime girlfriend, Emma, was still fresh, the pain etched clearly in the lines of his face. No matter how many times I asked him if he wanted to talk about it, his response was always the same: a weak shake of his head, a sad smile, and a quiet retreat to his old room. It wasn't like Caleb to sulk, but heartbreak has a way of making even the strongest of us falter. That afternoon, the house was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, its rays filtering through the frosted windows. I busied myself in the kitchen, preparing the first batch of Christmas cookies. Gingerbread, his favorite. The smell of cinnamon and cloves filled the air, and for a moment, I hoped it might coax him out of his room. Just as I slid the tray into the oven, I heard the soft creak of the stairs. My heart lifted slightly. Caleb appeared in the doorway, his dark hair messy, his eyes tired. He leaned against the frame, watching me with a faint smile. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice low but warm. "Hey, sweetheart," I replied, wiping my hands on a towel. "Cookies will be ready in about 10 minutes. He nodded, stepping into the room and sitting at the table. For a moment we were silent, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the hum of the oven. Then he spoke. "Emma used to love Christmas," he said, his voice tinged with wistfulness. "We'd spend hours picking out the perfect tree, decorating it with all these ridiculous ornaments we'd find at flea markets. She made everything feel magical." I turned to face him, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his tone. Caleb rarely opened up like this, and I didn't want to interrupt. He ran a hand through his hair, sighing deeply. "I keep thinking about how much of myself I poured into that relationship. And now it feels like a part of me is gone." I walked over and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You didn't lose yourself, Caleb," I said softly. "You're still here. The parts of you that loved and cared for her, they're still in you. And they'll find their way into something new, someone new when you're ready." He looked up at me, his eyes glistening, and for a moment, he was my little boy again, the one who used to cling to my leg when he was scared, who believed I had all the answers. "I wished I did." "Thanks, Mom," he murmured. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'll never have to find out," I replied, smiling gently. The timer on the oven beeped, breaking the moment. I retrieved the cookies, placing them on the counter to cool, and offered him one. He took it, biting into it with a small, appreciative smile. "You still make the best gingerbread," he said, his voice lighter now. We spent the rest of the evening in the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth as we decorated the tree together. Caleb even laughed a few times as we unearthed old ornaments, like the one he'd made in kindergarten that was supposed to be a snowman but looked more like a lumpy potato. By the time we finished, the tree was a glorious mess of color and light, a testament to years of memories and love. Caleb sat back on the couch, looking more at ease than he had in days. "You're going to be okay," I told him as I joined him. "Heartbreak is hard, but it's not the end. It's just the beginning of something different." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the tree. "I hope so." As the snow continued to fall outside, I felt a flicker of hope that this Christmas, though different, might still hold its own kind of magic. Caleb leaned back into the couch, his eyes fixed on the flickering Christmas lights, his expression thoughtful. Then, breaking the silence, he asked, "Was it hard for you, Mom, to go through the divorce with Dad?" His question caught me off guard, like a snowflake landing unexpectedly on warm skin. I hadn't anticipated him asking about it, especially not now, but in hindsight it made sense. He was searching for something, perhaps wisdom, perhaps reassurance that pain didn't last forever. I sighed, pulling the blanket on my lap a little tighter, gathering my thoughts. Yes, I began softly, meeting his gaze. It was hard. Harder than I ever expected it would be. Caleb turned to face me fully now. His interest evident. His silent encouragement made me feel like it was okay to let him in, even if just a little. For the longest time, I thought your dad and I were unshakable, I continued. We had history, love, and a family. But sometimes, love isn't enough to keep two people together. We grew apart, not in a dramatic, explosive way, but little by little, like driftwood being carried further and further from the shore. By the time I realized how far apart we were, we could hardly see each other anymore. I paused, brushing an invisible speck from the couch cushion, as memories I'd kept tightly locked away began to surface. It wasn't just losing a husband, Caleb. It felt like losing a version of myself. The woman I was with him, the life I thought we were building together. And it hurt to think I wasn't enough to make it work. Caleb frowned, his voice soft with empathy. But you were enough, Mom. He just couldn't see it. I smiled faintly, reaching over to touch his arm. Maybe. But I had to learn to stop measuring my worth by someone else's choices. That was the hardest part, not letting the hurt define me. How did you do it? He asked, leaning in like a boy seeking answers to a riddle that had no clear solution. It wasn't one thing, I admitted. It was time. A lot of time. And allowing myself to feel the pain instead of pretending it didn't exist. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of nights I cried myself to sleep. But eventually, I started focusing on what I still had. On you and the life I wanted to build for us. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to his hands. Feels like I lost a part of myself. Like the version of me that was with Emma doesn't know where to go now. Maybe he doesn't have to go anywhere, I said gently. Maybe that part of you just needs time to grow into something new. Every heartbreak teaches you something about who you are, Caleb. And I think it's okay to not have all the answers right now. His lips curled into a faint, bittersweet smile. It's just hard, you know. Letting go of someone you thought you'd always have. He nodded. It is hard. But the thing about love, Caleb, is that it's not a finite resource. Just because one relationship ends doesn't mean there isn't more love waiting for you out there. It's just hard to see it when you're standing in the middle of heartbreak. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he absorbed my words. Do you still believe in love after everything with Dad? The question hung in the air like a delicate snowflake, fragile and profound. I do, I said firmly. But it's not the fairy tale kind of love I believed in when I was young. I believe in the kind of love that takes work and patience, that grows from understanding and resilience. And even though it didn't work out with your dad, I'm grateful for the love we shared. Because it gave me you. A soft chuckle escaped his lips, and he shook his head. You always know what to say. Not always, I replied, squeezing his hand. But I know this, your heart will heal, Caleb. And when it does, you'll be stronger for it. He nodded, his expression thoughtful, and we fell into a comfortable silence, the glow of the Christmas tree casting a warm light over the room. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope, not just for him, but for the possibility that even in our most broken moments, love could find its way back to us. The days leading up to Christmas seemed to pass both too quickly and with an excruciating slowness, each moment magnified by the tension that began to weave itself into the air between Caleb and me. After that conversation about his heartbreak, and about my own, I could feel something shift. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a soft ripple disturbing the surface of calm water. But the more time we spent together, the clearer it became. He started to linger in the kitchen longer than he usually did, helping me with dinner preparations or simply standing by the counter, watching me. His compliments, which had once been casual and fleeting, began to carry a different weight. That sweater looks really nice on you, Mom, he said one evening as I stirred a pot of soup on the stove. His voice was warm but carried an undertone that caught me off guard. I glanced at him, trying to gauge his expression, but his face was unreadable. Thanks, sweetheart, I replied, keeping my tone light, though I couldn't ignore the faint flutter in my chest. Later that evening, we decorated the cookies we'd baked earlier. Caleb leaned closer than necessary as we worked, his shoulder brushing mine. I laughed nervously, brushing flour off my hands and trying to shift my focus back to the task at hand. But the proximity was impossible to ignore. "You've always had such a steady hand," he murmured, watching as I carefully piped icing onto a gingerbread man. I smiled, hoping to mask my growing unease. "Years of practice, I suppose." He chuckled, his eyes lingering on my face for just a moment too long. "It's not just that. You've always been graceful, strong." The compliment hung in the air, and I felt heat rise to my cheeks. I didn't know what to say, so I chose silence, focusing on the cookie in my hand. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day in my mind. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that I was overthinking things. Caleb was my son, and he was going through a vulnerable time. Of course he was seeking comfort and connection. But deep down, I knew there was something more to the way he looked at me, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. The next morning, I resolved to set firmer boundaries, to ensure that whatever had begun to stir between us was firmly put to rest. But as the day wore on, my resolve wavered. Caleb was attentive and warm, helping me wrap presents and hanging lights around the house. His laughter filled the space, and for the first time in days, he seemed genuinely happy. I didn't want to ruin that. So I pushed my unease aside, convincing myself that it was all in my head. But it wasn't. That evening, as we sat by the fire sipping hot cocoa, Caleb turned to me, his expression serious. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course," I replied, though my stomach tightened with anticipation. "Have you ever felt like someone saw you for who you really are? Like they truly appreciated everything about you?" The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I think so," I said finally. "Why do you ask?" He looked down at his mug, his fingers tracing the rim. "I don't think I appreciated you enough before. Everything you've done for me, the sacrifices you've made. You're incredible, Mom. And I don't think I've ever told you that." My throat tightened, and I forced a smile. "Thank you, Caleb. That means a lot." His eyes met mine, and for a moment, the air between us seemed to shift again, the warmth of the fire casting flickering shadows across his face. I felt a strange mix of emotions, pride, love, and something else I couldn't quite name. Something I didn't want to name. "I mean it," he said softly. "You're amazing." The intensity in his gaze was too much, and I looked away, my heart pounding. "You're sweet, Caleb," I murmured, trying to diffuse the moment. "Now, what do you say we watch a Christmas movie before bed?" He smiled, the moment passing as quickly as it had come. Your pick." As the movie played, I found myself hyper-aware of his presence beside me, the way his shoulder brushed mine, the warmth radiating from him. I told myself it was innocent, that I was reading too much into it. But deep down I knew something had changed between us. Something neither of us was ready to face. In the days that followed, the boundaries between Caleb and me seemed to blur further, though neither of us dared to openly acknowledge it. What started as fleeting moments of closeness gradually deepened, the spaces between us narrowing in ways that felt both comforting and confusing. He began hugging me more often, holding on a little longer than he used to. At first, I told myself it was just his way of seeking solace, of grounding himself in a familiar source of comfort after the heartbreak he'd endured. But the way his hands lingered on my back, the way he buried his face into my shoulder, breathing me in as if I were his anchor, it felt different. "Thank you for being here for me," he whispered one evening, his voice muffled against my shoulder during one of these hugs. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'll always have me," I replied, stroking his hair and trying to sound steady, though my pulse quickened each time he held me like that. The kisses on the cheek started soon after. They were sweet at first, simple pecks he'd give me as he passed by in the kitchen or when we said goodnight. But they, too, began to linger. His lips pressing against my skin for just a moment longer than necessary, the touch warm and deliberate. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, the soft glow of the Christmas tree lights filling the room. He turned to me suddenly. "You're amazing, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Before I could respond, he leaned in and kissed my cheek, his lips lingering near the corner of my mouth. My breath hitched, and for a fleeting second, the world seemed to hold its breath with me. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. I forced a smile, pretending that the moment hadn't unsettled me, but the truth was, it lingered with me long after. As the days passed, Caleb's attentiveness only grew. He'd stand closer when we cooked together, his shoulder brushing mine as he helped chop vegetables or stir sauces. He started offering to do small things for me, massaging my shoulders when I complained of stiffness, fetching me a blanket when we sat down to watch movies. His touches were always gentle, his hands lingering a little too long, as though he was memorizing the feel of me. One afternoon, as I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, Caleb came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. It was such a natural gesture, and yet it sent a shiver down my spine. "You're always doing so much for me," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "I wish there was a way I could repay you." "You don't have to repay me," I said softly, my hands trembling slightly as I set the dish down. "You're my son, Caleb. That's what mothers do." He pulled back slightly, his arms still around me, and turned me to face him. His eyes searched mine, filled with a depth of emotion that made my chest tighten. "You're more than just my mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're everything." I froze, unsure how to respond. His words were laden with a meaning I wasn't ready to confront, and the intensity in his gaze left me feeling exposed. "Caleb," I began, but he shook his head, stepping back and breaking the moment. "Sorry," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't mean to make things weird." "You didn't," I said quickly, though my voice was shaky. Let's finish up here." That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the moment over and over in my mind. I couldn't deny that something was happening between us, something that neither of us seemed to have control over. And though I knew I should set clearer boundaries, the warmth of his affection, the way he looked at me like I was his whole world, it was intoxicating in a way I couldn't quite explain. But as much as I cared for him, as much as his presence filled a part of my heart I hadn't realized was empty, I also knew we were treading on dangerous ground. And the closer we grew, the harder it became to ignore.